Hi, my name is Lina Petrakieva and I'm going to show you what an academic poster is and what are the main features and how you can create one. I'm going to explain what a poster is. I'm going to show you how to structure your content and how to arrange the flow of the information on the poster. I'm going to give you also some design tips and explain the steps in creating a poster. A poster is a static visual medium designed to be printed and presented on a vertical surface. It's used to communicate ideas and messages. There are two main types of posters: information poster and academic poster. The information poster is targeted at the general public and is normally very light in terms of information available, much more visual, much more free-flowing, and it's the kind of posters you will see if you're sitting in your GP's waiting room. For example, why you should have this flu vaccine and what are the symptoms of whatever disease. This is general information, as I said, very, very simple, very light in terms of content. There is usually not a lot of referencing, so the general public will find it easier to understand, and it's usually focused on one message. An academic poster, on the other side, is much more targeting people that are your peers, and the language will be academic, there will be proper references, it will be much more scientific in its nature. It's much more structured, and usually because of that it's slightly boring. And it's very difficult to make it more appealing simply because the structure is limiting of what you can do in terms of design. It's also using proper references, the same as any other academic piece of writing. The general structure of an academic research poster is same as any other written piece of work: introduction, methodology or aims, main findings, discussion on those findings, conclusions, and a list of references that are used on the poster itself. It is using academic language, as I mentioned, and you have to use appropriate references. In terms of the balance of information on the poster itself, compared to other things you may have done before. For example, if you think of an essay, it's entirely written, there's no verbal presentation at all, and compare it with a PowerPoint presentation where there's hardly anything in the PowerPoint itself and it's almost all verbal information. So written information very much in terms of the essays, and reports and dissertations, and verbal information very much towards the PowerPoint presentation. The poster is in the middle of that scale. There is enough information written on the poster itself, so if someone reads the poster, they should be able to get the gist of the information. But normally there is verbal presentation as well, where the presenter can go in more detail, can explain things that there wasn't enough space on the poster, for example, to put, and also can answer more in-depth questions. The poster should have a very clear title, and for a standard size A1 poster, the title should be readable from about 5 to 6 meters, so it has to be very big and clear. The author's name should be listed there and the institutions they represent, especially if the poster is presented externally. If you're creating a poster for internal class presentation, normally the institution is not needed to be listed there simply because it is for internal audience only. The institutional logo has to be at the top of the poster, and you have to have very clear headings of all the different sections on your poster. You need to have the right amount of text, typically 1 or 2 paragraphs per section, although some sections will obviously have more, probably your main findings, and maybe your discussion will probably have more paragraphs. But generally, you're trying to limit the amount of text you fit on a poster. You need to use graphical content throughout the poster, and in context it has to be very clear what this graphic is representing, and the text around it should be referring to that graphic. And by graphics I mean images, diagrams, charts, tables, and anything really that is not text. Any reader should be able to read information on the poster within about 5 minutes. You have to consider your audience. The information should be pitched at the right level. So if you are presenting at a professional body gathering, the others that are going to read this information will be from your profession. So you could use terminology that potentially may not be understood by others from different fields. And when you're presenting, you would be there to give details and answer any questions. So this is one good example of a poster. I'm going to zoom it so you can see better. And this poster, as you can see, is very, very clearly structured. The structure in the poster has to be overemphasized. You need to have big, clear headings. And as I mentioned, they generally are about introduction and methods and aims and findings, but they don't need to be called like that, as long as that is the general meaning. And depending on what are you presenting, potentially some of them may be missing, or there may be more, or you may need more than one of them. The structure has to be obvious, clear, and it needs to flow easily. So whoever is reading the poster must be able to read and follow the information throughout, because the structure is actually linear. When you look at the introduction, methods and findings, they just follow one after the other. And if you're writing a report or a dissertation, everything flows from one section to the next and on the next page and so on. But on a poster, you have a rectangular piece of paper and you need to fit a linear structure within that. So it will need to be organized either in columns or in rows, but it has to be clear which way people are supposed to read. And in English, you will always start from the top left corner. So the first section will always be there. But which way people follow after that will depend on how you design your poster to make it obvious. So in this particular example, you can see the most obvious thing are the numbers. And numbers are very crude, but they work, and people will follow the numbers if you put numbers of your headings. However, much more subtle and usually much more effective way to emphasize the flow of the information is to look at the distance between the different sections, because people will normally follow whichever section is the closest to the one you've just read. So if you look at the distance between section 1 and section 2, it's very, very small compared to the distance between 1 and 3. So after reading section 1, you would naturally follow down to section 2 because that distance is much smaller. So if you prefer people follow rows of information, just make sure the distance to the right is much smaller than the distance below. So you have to design the poster in a way to make it obvious how people are supposed to read and follow the information. Another approach that is also used on this particular example is using vertical lines to separate the columns. They could have been in darker color, which would have made them more obvious, but using vertical or horizontal lines to split the columns or the rows will make it much easier as well to follow the information, to see that it's organized in columns or rows. In terms of the balance of information on this poster, you can see that there is a nice balance between text and graphics, which is very, very difficult to achieve. And obviously, depending on the topic, you may not have a lot of graphics to include, but you'll have to try and break up your text with some relevant graphics. It could be tables, it could be diagrams, it could be pictures, whatever makes sense for your text, for your actual information. At the end of this poster, you will see the references listed. They have to be always at the end of the poster. Could be either as a last section underneath the last of the content, or they could be a banner at the bottom of the poster and they could all be listed there. You can see at the top also big and clear title. The names of the authors clearly listed and the institution which they represent, together with the actual institution logo. If your title is relatively short, like this one for example is 2 lines of text that fit in the middle of the poster, you may end up with a space on the right hand side or the left hand side depending on where you put the logo. Please don't leave this space empty. You need to put something in there that will be informative, illustrative and meaningful for the poster itself, because if you don't, it will look like you've forgotten something. You have big empty space. Empty spaces are important in terms of organizing the information, making sure things are not too crammed, but big empty spaces look like there isn't enough information or there's something forgotten or missing. In terms of the color scheme of this particular poster, you can see it's very, very simple. You have white background, black text and dark red accent color with the secondary yellow accent color to use for the numbers and the lines and as a banner underneath the title of the poster. This kind of color scheme is simple but effective. It allows the poster to have a bit of interest, a bit of life in it without overpowering colors and without leaving it too boring either. It's a very fine balance you need to strike between having it simple, structured and organized but not boring. When you're choosing your accent colors, you have to be careful to choose a color that will allow you to have good contrast with the font that you may use over that color. So for that reason, avoid colors that are within the middle range, so not too dark, not too light, simply because then it's going to be very difficult to find font color that will give you that good contrast. So if you pick, for example, green, and if you write white font color on it or black font color on it, it's going to be very difficult to decide which one looks better. And that is a good indication that probably the original base color, the green, is the wrong color to use. So you can use a darker color, dark green, or a lighter shade of green. And that will allow you to pick the font color to give you that good contrast. And now, not so good example of a poster. This particular poster has a lot of issues with it. I'm just going to zoom it so you can see it better. And as you can see, you have very confusing use of colors. Every single box is in a different color or different shade of a color. You have very confusing flow of information. So initially you start with the abstract with the top left corner, and then you follow the introduction because that's the closest section. But then it gets really confusing which way you're supposed to follow, because the one that would naturally follow below, which is very, very close to it, is actually the conclusions. So the flow is confusing and it doesn't help the reader understand where they're supposed to follow the information. There's only one graphic used and it's completely out of context. It's not very clear, is this image relevant to the abstract or is part of your conclusions or is something to do with the acknowledgements, because it doesn't have any context. It's just a space that needed filling and there's a graphic in it. Another thing to avoid is using all capitals. A lot of people still think that using all capitals makes it big and clear. Actually, it makes it more difficult to read, so avoid using all capitals. And underlining also makes it very, very difficult to read. So in this particular case, all the headings of the different sections are in all capitals and underlined, which makes it extremely difficult to read, especially if someone has visual problems. Generally, you can see also this particular poster has too many effects. The Star Wars effect on the writing makes it very difficult to read. You have very busy background, also making it more difficult to read. The dark background with light font is usually very difficult to read in most circumstances. And in general, the poster just looks too busy, too messy. This actually is not a real poster. This has been specifically designed as an example of a bad poster. And as I was mentioning, the dark background, it is very difficult to make dark background and light color to work, simply because it only works well when you have dark room, and not a lot of poster presentations are made in dark rooms. So generally speaking, the background of the poster should match the lighting in the room. So in most circumstances, the light background will work better. And when you're choosing your accent colors, ideally choose just one accent color to use throughout your poster, for example, as a font color for your headings, or maybe a background for those headings. If you need to use lines to separate rows and columns, you can use the same color throughout. If you have diagrams, use the same color in those diagrams, just to bring it all together to give the consistent look of the poster. You could use two accent colors, but you have to be very careful how you use them, simply because if you start alternating, people will start to look for connection, why those two things are the same color, and maybe there is some sort of meaning in the grouping of them, and different things maybe with a different accent color, so maybe there's link between them but they're not connected to the first colors. So it may get confusing because marking it with the same color implies connection, and when you have two different colors implies there's different connection. So if you are using two accent colors, make the second accent color secondary, so use it very, very sparingly. So if you see the example on the screen, there is an orange yellow secondary color, which is just a little dot in front of the line under the headings, and also as smaller bubbles in the diagrams, so it doesn't confuse with the use of the first accent color. And also just a little note, if you're printing your poster on an A3 size printer, usually those printers are office printers, so they would not be able to print until the edge of the paper, what is called bleeding the color. So if you are using a background color in your poster, A3 size printer will not print until the end, so you'll have a white border around your poster. So in this case, it's probably better just to use a white background to avoid having this white border. When creating a poster that is going to be printed in big size, it's very, very important to consider the quality of the images that you're going to be using. Generally, you require a minimum of 150 pixels for every inch that you print, which means that when you pick an image, look at the number of pixels that this image has, divide that by 150, and that will give you the maximum size of this image in inches. So for example, if you have a picture that is 600 pixels wide, divide that by 150 dots per inch, which is pixels per inch, then that will give you 4 inches width is the maximum size this image should be used. And obviously the software will use centimeters, so you'll need to convert the inches into centimeters, and that's roughly about 10 centimeter size. So if this image is used with maximum 10 centimeter size on the poster itself, this image will print in good quality. If you make it bigger, the pixels will become bigger and it will look blurred. Another useful way to use graphics within your poster is to use Smart Art Diagrams. It's a tool available in Word and in PowerPoint, and it's extremely easy to use. It allows you to convert what normally would be explanatory text into diagrams, which are much more visual, much easier to understand, and also will break up your text. So for example, if you have recommendations on your poster, instead of just listing them as bullet points, there are Smart Art Diagrams that are lists, and you can use some of them to present those findings and those recommendations in a graphical way. Same with pros and cons, for example, or different approaches, or if you're trying to show what reflective cycle you've used in your work, you could do that as a Smart Art Diagram rather than describing it. In terms of sizes, the font size is recommended for an A1 size poster. For a title, generally, we need to be about 90 points. However, the 90 points are just a ballpark figure and they're a useful guidance. But if your title goes over 2 lines of text, you'll need to reduce that font size, otherwise it will use up too much space on your poster. Avoid titles that are too long. A maximum should be about 2 lines of text on your poster. If your title is too long and it ends up on 3 or more lines, it looks like a whole paragraph. It doesn't look like a title. So you have to be careful and keep it short and brief and right to the point. So title of 2 lines of text will probably about font size 70. The author's names and the section headings of the different parts of the poster would generally be about font size 60. However, again, if your title is already reduced in size, so it's close to 70, you should reduce also the author names and the section headings so they don't look too similar in size. But anything between 40 points and 60 points should look okay for author's names and section headings. The poster text itself ideally would be about font size 30. However, that is very, very rarely possible simply because there's always too much to say on the poster, but it should never drop below 24 points. And this is for A1 size poster. If you start having to reduce your poster's text to below 24, that usually means you have too much text and too much information on your poster, and you have to revisit the poster and try to organize it better and to reduce the unnecessary information. The figure captions and any references on the poster should be in smaller size. Usually 18 points would be recommended. However, if you need to reduce the font size because you have too many references, for example, try to keep with a minimum of font size 12. And as I mentioned earlier, try to avoid using uppercase and any abbreviations. If you have to use abbreviations, make sure you introduce them first and avoid abbreviations within the title of the poster because not many people will be aware of what that abbreviation would mean, unless this is something very, very common, for example NHS or IT, when those abbreviations have been widely used and they're familiar to everyone. In terms of the font types, you should use a maximum of 2 different types of fonts on your poster. It could be 1 or a maximum of 2. There are 2 main types of fonts. There's serif fonts and sans serif fonts. A Times New Roman font is an example of a serif font where the serifs are all those little ornaments on the side of the letters. Those types of fonts look good when they're printed big, when they're printed, not projected. So they could be useful for using, for example, for the title of the poster or any section headings. Sans serif fonts are fonts without serif. Sans serif literally means without serifs. So fonts like Arial or Calibri will be examples of such fonts. And they are much clearer if they're printed smaller or in a presentation, for example. So you could have your entire poster in sans serif font, or you can have your title and section headings in serif or sans serif. The poster text, depending how big it is, it could be serif or sans serif. And the captions and references, because they will be much smaller font size, it's probably best to be sans serif font. If your poster size is smaller than A1, for each size you drop, you need to reduce recommended font sizes with 30%. So for A2 size poster, your title should be roughly about 60 points, the author's names and the section headings would be roughly size 40, and the text itself on the poster should be about font size 20, and any figure captions or references should be about font size 12. As I mentioned earlier, the flow of the information is of crucial importance. It has to be very, very clear. And when you start designing a poster, it's always a good idea to start sketching down the design of your poster on a piece of paper and thinking about where all the different sections are going to go and how big you roughly think they're going to be. However, when you start creating a poster, you may find that actually the initial plan doesn't quite work because you have too much or too little in some of those sections and some of those columns and rows. So it's very important to have enough time to be prepared to start a completely different design of the flow of the information and how the information is organized that will work with your content. You have to check as well when you're designing a poster, do you have any restrictions on the orientation of the poster? Will it need to be portrait or landscape? Because that will also determine how you organize your information on it. And if you don't have any restrictions, if the information doesn't quite fit in the original plan, you may need to actually change the orientation as well. Not just change columns to rows or the number of columns or the number of rows. You may need to change the orientation as well. It is vitally important that at the end, the poster should flow naturally and it should be clear for the reader to follow it. There are two main softwares you could use to create a poster. One of them is PowerPoint. However, PowerPoint is designed for presentations, not for printed materials. So there are some features that would be useful to have that don't exist in PowerPoint. However, this is the only software you could use if you're using a Mac, simply because the other recommended software, Publisher, doesn't exist for Mac. Publisher is also part of Microsoft Office, so it's very familiar. Even if you've never used it before, when you open it, you will see that it's very similar to all the other softwares that you are familiar with, like Word and PowerPoint. It is specifically designed for publications, so there are a lot of useful tools inside. For example, there is a gallery of design objects, like really good looking headings or text boxes or frames and borders that you could use directly. There's also an option to include guidelines that will help you structure your poster better when you're designing it. The guidelines don't print. There is also text wrapping, which means the text can wrap around the image, which PowerPoint doesn't do. The main limitation of Publisher is that it doesn't exist for Mac. So if you're using a Mac computer, you will have to use PowerPoint. However, neither PowerPoint or Publisher can do everything, and it's always a good idea to consider what are you trying to create and is there a better software you could use? And you simply pick the right tool for the right job. For example, if you're creating a chart, you could create the chart in PowerPoint, but PowerPoint has very limited capacity to do that. You're much better off using Excel or even SPSS or Minitab or whatever other statistical package you end up using and create your charts there. And then simply copy and paste them onto your poster. If you're using smart art diagrams, they don't exist in Publisher, for example, but they do in Word and PowerPoint. So you can go in Word and PowerPoint, design them there, adjust the colors to match your color scheme and include them on your poster. If you're creating your own diagrams or flowcharts, there's a software also part of Microsoft Office called Visio that is specifically for creating diagrams, or there's a free software called Inkscape that you can use to do that. The page parts, which is this design gallery that I mentioned earlier, exists in Publisher. So if you need to use PowerPoint because you're using Mac computer, you can still access Publisher on campus and look at those page parts and copy them onto PowerPoint to use on your poster. So you can mix and match whatever software you need to get the job done. And finally, the steps in creating a poster. It is crucial that you do your research first. You have to make sure everything is clear in your head before you start putting it down on the poster, simply because the poster is an essence of this information. So unless you understand it well and you know all the details, it's very difficult to extract what is important and what is not. And while you're doing your research, you can keep notes and you can draft the text of each section as you go along. And all the time as you're doing that, look at any information that is not essential, and you'll probably not have space for it, so you can just mark it as non-essential or remove it altogether. And also, while you're collecting this information, look at what can be presented graphically and make a note of it, or even just sketch it on a piece of paper. After you've completed the content gathering, you can decide now which software to use. Obviously, you have limitations depending on the computer you want to use. Then make sure you set up the right size to start with. For example, the recommended A1 size is 84 or 84.1 centimeters by 59.4 centimeters. And then sketch out the poster layout. It could be just boxes, it could be using guidelines, depending on which software you use, but make sure you split up all the different rows and columns, and ideally even the boxes and all the different sections. Have a look at the color schemes available in that software and decide what color scheme you're going to use based on the topic of your poster, the audience you're presenting, the presentation type, and the location. If there is strong association with specific colors already with a particular topic, if you use them, that will bring it all together even more. And then you can start putting it all together, copying and pasting or typing directly the text in each section onto your poster, adding all the graphics, diagrams, images, whatever you need to use on your poster, and rearranging the text and the graphics to optimize the design and the flow. And this part, the rearranging, is really the most difficult, simply because the vast majority of the cases, your initial plan will probably not work, because once you put it all together, you realize that it's not usually the same size as you imagined, or the graphics may need to be bigger, or sometimes you cannot find the appropriate graphics, so you may need to remove it. And this can take most of your time. You'll need to be prepared to keep on going and trying to fit it. And if you see that you arrive at the dead end and you cannot really fit it in that design, just save the file under a different name and try something very different. Try fewer or more columns or rows. Try changing the orientation even, or moving some text around, or changing some of the graphics. But every time you do a major change, make sure you save the file under a different name, because your new design may end up even worse than the previous one. So in that case, you don't need to try and undo it. You can just go back to the previous version of the file you saved and try a different option from there. Creating a poster is very much like fitting a jigsaw puzzle together, but you can change all the pieces all the time. You can cut a little bit of the text, or you can add a bit more text. You can change the picture that you're using. You can make it bigger or smaller. And that will obviously change the entire flow and the space around the poster. The final poster should simply flow, and it needs to look very structured. That's the main aim. It is very important also to remember that you need to keep the font sizes identical throughout the poster. So if you end up with too much text in one section, you cannot just reduce the font size in that particular section. You need to reduce it everywhere, which may open up gaps in different parts of the poster. And this is why this stage of creating a poster can take most of the time, until you make sure everything is nicely balanced and it all fits and flows naturally. Remove any non-essential information. Usually the poster is presented as well, so any desirable information can be explained verbally during the presentation. On the poster, you don't have the space, so the poster has to be the very essence of the information, just enough to get the reader the basic knowledge and understanding of the information you're trying to convey. Keep reading the text again and check for spelling mistakes. Don't rely on the spell checker. A lot of the times when you make a mistake, you may end up with a different word, which obviously the spell checker will not pick up. So make sure you read it carefully and give yourself enough time between different reads, because having a fresh eyes is always useful. Keep saving regularly. Every time you make a change that will require more than a few steps, save it. And regularly save it as different versions. You can keep the same name and just call it version 1, 2, 3, and whatever numbers you need to make sure if anything happens with the file, you have previous version to go to and you haven't lost a lot of information. And when you're ready, save a copy as a PDF file. simply go to File, Save As, and you will see the option to change the type of file to a PDF. It doesn't matter if you're using Publisher or PowerPoint, you will be able to save a PDF file. But remember, the PDF file is the one you send for printing, it's the one you submit if it's an assignment. However, it cannot be edited. So your PDF file is a sealed copy. So always keep the original file available. Is it Publisher or PowerPoint file? It doesn't matter. You have to keep it available in case you find any more typos or you need to make some changes. You don't want to start creating the whole poster from scratch again. So keep the PDF file as a copy, but always have the original file available. It's also a very good idea to print a small sample of your poster. You can print it on an A4 sheet or A3 if you have access to a printer that size. If you're using PowerPoint, when you go to print option, you will see one of the options is scaled to fit paper. So the poster will be scaled to fit whatever paper size you've specified. If you're using Publisher, don't print directly from Publisher. Open the PDF file that you've created, and from there you will see an option when you go to printing. You will see an option called Fit, and it will fit whatever paper size you specified for that printer. So you can print an A1 size poster on an A3 sheet of paper. It's always a good idea to print paper because it will look different and you will see it better and you will see it closer to what it actually will look like when it's printed in full size. And when you print it, look over that sample print, make any final changes that you need to, and it's a good idea to give it to someone else for a fresh pair of eyes because they may see something that is quite obvious for anyone else, but it's going to be difficult for you to spot because you've been working too close to it. Make your final changes, save your poster, and save a copy of your poster in PDF. Make backups of all those files all the way through. It's always a good idea to have backups of your files. Don't just save them on your computer and rely on it or on a memory stick because any piece of technology can fail. So make sure you spread your risk. Make sure you email a copy, for example, of your file regularly so you have a copy in your mailbox, or keep a copy on your computer and on a memory stick, and start practicing your presentation. For help using PowerPoint or Publisher to create posters, you can go to the Learning Development Centre community in GCU Learn, or you can access it directly from the link on the screen. There is also a full vidcast available showing you how to create a poster using Publisher, and the link is also available here. Good luck!